Welcome to our third video in this series on the Dead Sea Scrolls and our Catholic beliefs. In this video, we'll talk about the sacrament of Eucharist and the light that the Dead Sea Scrolls can shed on our understanding, our Catholic beliefs for the Eucharist. Many of our Protestant brothers and sisters believe that we as Catholics, that we have over-ritualized communion, that Jesus simply meant communion to just be, hey, guys, let's get together and let's just remember, get together and remember me in the future. That's all that Jesus was saying, and that the Catholic Church over time ritualized this meal and added all these dimensions that the gospel writers, the apostles didn't really understand, didn't really mean, in the Eucharist. But we believe that it is truly a celebration of the new covenant, that we are renewing that new covenant with God every time we receive it, that we're actually being changed, that we're actually participating in the Passover sacrifice. So let's look at what we can understand, looking at what the Essenes believed and what's written in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's look at that Last Supper, right, where Jesus instituted the Eucharist, and what can we start to understand about the Eucharist and what the apostles would have understood about it as Jesus instituted the Eucharist there at the Last Supper. Well, the first question that comes up is, when was the Last Supper celebrated? The Synoptic Gospel writers say that the Last Supper was the celebration of the Passover, that Jesus was celebrating the Passover with the apostles there at the Last Supper. But John says in his gospel that Jesus was crucified on the preparation day for the Passover, which meant then, according to John, the Passover meal wouldn't have been celebrated until the evening after Christ was crucified, so that he couldn't have been celebrating the Passover with his apostles. So which way is it? Did Jesus celebrate the Passover with his apostles? Is that what the Last Supper is? Or, according to John, was the Last Supper just another meal that Jesus celebrated with his apostles before he was crucified, before the Passover celebration? Well, the answer to both those questions is yes. It seems like there were multiple celebrations of the Passover at the time of Jesus. The Essenes had their own celebration of the Passover. John, earlier in his gospel, talks about the Passover of the Jews, which is an interesting statement, right? It's like saying the 4th of July of the Americans. Why would you need to qualify the 4th of July of the Americans? Aren't the Americans the only ones who celebrate the 4th of July? Why would John need to qualify the Passover to say the Passover of the Jews? The Jews were the only ones that celebrated the Passover. See, that word Jews actually should be translated Judeans. It's just one of the tribes of Israel. The people, most of the people who lived in Jerusalem, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they would all see themselves as being Jews, of being of Judea. But the Essenes, they saw themselves as being different. They saw themselves as being of Israel, all 12 tribes of Israel. And so they saw themselves different. And they had their own Passover celebration. So you had the Passover of the Jews, and you had the Passover of the Essenes. The Samaritans also had their own calendar and had their own Passover, so you'd also have had the Passover of the Samaritans. Today, right, we have multiple celebrations of the Easter. Christians have one calendar they use and celebrate Easter on one Sunday. Our Orthodox brothers and sisters, they have a different liturgical calendar and celebrate Easter on a different Sunday. It seems like it was that way in the time of Jesus, where there were these different calendars, these different liturgical calendars. We can tell from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Essenes would always celebrate their Passover on Wednesday, the Passover meal then being Tuesday evening. See, the Essenes had a 364-day calendar, which means it was divisible by 7, which means their feast wouldn't move from one day of the week to the next, right? So like here, right, one year we'll celebrate Christmas on Tuesday, the next year we'll celebrate Christmas on Wednesday, because we have a 365-day calendar. But if you have a 364-day calendar, which is divisible by 7, those feasts wouldn't move. And it appears the Essenes' feast of Passover was always on Wednesday. The celebration then of their Passover meal would have been on Tuesday evening. So could Jesus have celebrated the Passover of the Essenes with his apostles there on Tuesday evening, and then was indeed crucified on the preparation day of the Passover of the Jews, which was then on Friday? You know, this makes a lot of sense that the celebration of the Last Supper would have been a few days before the crucifixion. And you look at all of the events that happened there between the time that Jesus was arrested and the time that of his crucifixion, right? He was brought into the high priest court. He was taken to Pilate. He was taken to Herod, back to Pilate. He was scourged. That's a lot to happen from Thursday evening to Friday at noon, which is when John tells us that Jesus' crucifixion started at noon on the preparation day. See, it would make a lot more sense that the Passover was celebrated on Tuesday, that Jesus celebrated the Passover of the Essenes on Tuesday, was arrested there Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, right? Then taken before the high priest, taken to Pilate, all that over Wednesday and Thursday, scourged probably Friday morning, and then finally taken to his crucifixion then Friday at noon. It's interesting that some in the early church fasted on Wednesday, saying that that was the day of Jesus' arrest and trials. So there's a lot of evidence to support that Jesus may have been celebrating the Passover of the Essenes there, that's what the Last Supper was about. And then he was crucified then on Friday, which was the preparation day for the Passover of the Jews. We also look and we find that the place where Jesus celebrated the Passover, what we now know as the cenacle, scholars pretty much agree where in Jerusalem that cenacle, where the site of the Last Supper is. And it's interesting that that site of the cenacle, the place where we believe the Last Supper was, is close to what scholars have found, think to be the Essene gate for the Essenes. For one thing, right outside of this gate, they have found latrines. They have found restroom facilities out there. The Essenes believed that you couldn't go to the restroom, that it was not proper to go to the restroom inside the city walls, inside this sacred city walls. And so they would go, so scholars believe that they would go out through this Essene gate to use the restrooms that were just right outside the city there. It's one of the things that tells them that this was probably an Essene gate. This area here where the cenacle is, where the place that we believe the Last Supper was celebrated, was within an Essene community. And then Luke tells us that Jesus told Peter and John that they should go into the city and that there they would meet a man carrying a jar of water, and to follow that man, and he would take you to a place, to a house, to ask the master there if their master could celebrate Passover with his disciples there at the house. Well, you know, at first glance you say, well, a man carrying water, weren't there a lot of men carrying water all around? What is that all about? Well, no, there weren't a lot of men carrying water, because carrying water was a woman's job. We see that, right? The woman at the well, she was out there getting water. We were told other women came earlier to gather water. carrying water was a woman's job. That is, unless you lived in a community all of men. We know the Essenes had these kind of monastic-like communities, just like we talked about earlier at Qumran being a monastic-like community, a community all of men. So it's believed that this Essene community within Jerusalem was a community all of men. And so then it would make sense that a man would be carrying water and go into a house of the Essenes, the place where they gathered. And we know from historians, we've talked before about Josephus, he tells us that the Essenes would always have a guest house, would always have a place to take care of strangers. He says that there is in every city where they live, one appointed particularly to take care of strangers. So it makes sense that this man carrying water would be carrying water to the guest house. And that was where then they would go to this guest house, this Essene guest house, to celebrate Passover, celebrate the Passover of the Essenes. So quite a few examples there of why we could believe that Jesus was celebrating the Passover of the Essenes on Tuesday night and then crucified then on the preparation day of the Passover of the Jews. Another interesting thing is scholars debate whether or not there would have been lamb at the Passover of the Essenes. What's known is the Essenes were excluded from the temple. They couldn't sacrifice in the temple, so they couldn't sacrifice a paschal lamb in the temple. Now, they had a tradition of having holy meals with bread and wine, right? That which what the Last Supper was. And so there's many scholars that believe that the Passover meal was a meal of just bread and wine that was celebrated by the Essenes. The Essenes actually had a daily ritual that involved a meal with bread and wine, a daily ritual, just like we have daily Mass. And we look at their daily ritual of this eating of bread, drinking of wine, and we see a lot of similarities to the Last Supper and the things that the accounts that the gospel writers, the evangelists give us about the Last Supper in the Gospels, and the way that we find that this sacred meal, the sacred daily meal that was celebrated by the Essenes, was to be celebrated. We start with that this meal of bread and wine, that the priest would wash their feet and their hands before celebrating this sacred meal. Thus, Jesus, right, washing the feet of the apostles, saying, "You are the priests going in." We, in our Catholic beliefs, we believe that it was there at the Last Supper that Jesus instituted the priesthood there as he instituted the sacrament of the Eucharist. And so it seems that Jesus, by washing the feet of the apostles, were saying, you're now all the priests here ready to celebrate at these sacred daily meals of bread and wine. But then at the end of the meal, Jesus takes the cup of wine, as we know, and says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Interesting there, we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Essenes thought of themselves as being part of the new covenant, that the new covenant had already arrived and they were a new covenant community. In fact, they saw this daily meal of bread and wine as being their celebration of the new covenant. And so when Jesus took the cup and said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, the apostles would have thought about that and would have said, yes, he's instituting the real new covenant, not that fake new covenant that the Essenes believe, but that we are now all part of this new covenant with the Messiah here instituting that new covenant. And then Jesus says that this is a new covenant for the many. That's caused a lot of consternation in the church, especially recently, that he said that he would shed his blood for the many rather than for all. right? Were there people that are excluded? Are there people who are not saved? Because Jesus said that this is the new covenant of my blood, which will be shed on behalf of the many. Well, it turns out, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Essenes used that word many for their community. They would talk about themselves being the many. And so when Jesus said, this is the blood of the new covenant, which will be shed on behalf of many, on behalf of my community, on behalf of the community, that's how the apostles would have interpreted it. For anybody who was who accepted to be part of the community there, that was who the many were. And then Jesus says, do this in memory of me. And that word that he uses there, memory in Greek, would be anamnêsin. And it had a very special meaning to the Essenes, to the people at the time. A temple offering would be considered to be remembering the covenant. It's the idea that when you made an offering in the temple, you remembered the covenant and God remembered the covenant, that y'all remade the covenant, that you remembered the covenant, that it wasn't a new contract, right? But it was remembering the covenant that you had made. In this case, they would have seen it as remembering this new covenant that Jesus was making with them. In fact, right, when the Essenes would gather for this daily ritual, this daily meal of bread and wine, they saw that as renewing their new covenant, as remembering the new covenant that they had. So there are a lot of connections between this daily ritual that the Essenes had of gathering together to eat bread and wine, and to remember this new covenant that they believed they had entered into with God. So it's really easy to see how those the apostles, how the early church would have said, yes, okay, we need to continue this celebration. You know, I've always wondered why we as Catholics celebrate daily Mass, how that tradition got started. You know, why didn't we just meet on the Sabbath, or just like if it's a Passover meal, why didn't we just do it once a year? Why this daily celebration? Well, that makes some sense, that the apostles were just continuing this tradition of the Essenes of gathering to celebrate that daily ritual of bread and wine, to celebrate the new covenant. But what they understood was this was the new covenant instituted by Jesus Christ, that this new covenant was from the sacrifice of the new Paschal Lamb, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And they would meet daily in their places to celebrate this new covenant, to partake in this sacrifice on a daily basis. They understood that to be something more than just remembering Jesus. Yeah, okay, we'll get together and share good times, remember when he was here, talk about his times here. No, they saw it as a sacred meal, as a sacred ritual in which they were gathering together, eating bread and wine that had truly become the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, was truly that sacrifice that was made. Each day, as they celebrated that sacrifice, they would remember, they would renew the new covenant that Jesus had made with them. So to me, it is just so fascinating how things that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls start pointing to this idea of sacramentality that we have as Catholics, that the sacraments are more than just remembering Jesus or an affirmation of our faith, but that the sacraments really do change us, that we really do change in the sacrament of baptism, become a new person, allow the Spirit to enter into us, that the Eucharist is more than just a meal of remembrance, but it is truly changing us to enter in to this new covenant, offering this sacrifice that is the bread, the wine that has been changed into the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. I hope you've enjoyed these presentations about the Dead Sea Scrolls and our Catholic beliefs. Thank you for joining us today.